Human child befriends baby T-Rex. What happens next is beyond belief. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The forest was alive with the sounds of 1,000 small things. Birds chirping in high branches, insects buzzing in patches of sunlight that broke through the thick canopy, and the faint rustle of leaves as a soft breeze passed through. In this little corner of the world, everything felt untouched, ancient even. The trees stood tall and proud, their trunks gnarled with age, their roots spreading like quiet sentinels of time. In the midst of it all was a boy. Tommy wasn't like most kids his age. At 6 years old, he was small for his age, with a mop of dark brown hair and bright, curious eyes that always seemed to be searching for something hidden. While most children were content watching cartoons or chasing after soccer balls, Tommy had always been drawn to places where others didn't go. Hidden streams, wooded clearings, and the dark, quiet places where the world seemed to keep its secrets. This morning had started like any other. His parents had brought him on a weekend camping trip, and while they were busy setting up camp, Tommy had wandered off with nothing but a bag of crackers and his favorite green t-shirt. His parents knew he had a habit of exploring, but they figured he'd stay close enough to hear them call when lunch was ready. But Tommy had other plans. He had followed a narrow deer trail into the woods, his small sneakers brushing through the damp leaves. The air smelled of moss and earth, a clean, comforting scent that made him smile. He liked it out here, where there were no rules, no noise, and no grown-ups telling him what to do. Tommy was searching for something, anything, when he stumbled upon the clearing. At first, he wasn't sure what had caught his attention. The space was quiet, surrounded on all sides by tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt secret, like a place that had been forgotten by the rest of the world. He liked that, but then he saw it. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was a flash of green, large, solid, and unlike anything Tommy had ever seen before. His heart skipped a beat, his fingers freezing in midair as he reached for another cracker. The thing moved again, shifting slightly behind the trees, and Tommy blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Slowly, he took a step forward. "Hello?" he called softly. There was no response. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves overhead, the forest holding its breath. Tommy squinted, his eyes adjusting to the shadows. And that's when he saw it. It was a creature. A strange, impossibly real creature that looked like it had stepped out of one of the dinosaur books Tommy loved so much. Its skin was smooth and green, dappled with faint stripes that helped it blend into the shadows. Its head was large and slightly awkward for its small body, with wide amber eyes that stared at Tommy with an expression that could only be described as curiosity. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. "A dinosaur," he whispered. The creature tilted its head, its nostrils flaring slightly as it sniffed the air. It didn't move toward him, but it didn't run away either. Instead, it just watched, blinking slowly as though it wasn't quite sure what to make of the tiny human standing before it. Tommy felt his fear ebb away, replaced by something else, something warm and wondrous. He knew what this was. It was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. He'd seen pictures in his books, watched them stomp across screens in movies, but those had always been big and scary, with teeth like knives and roars that shook the ground. But this one was different. It was small, no taller than Tommy himself, its awkward proportions making it look almost cute. Its front limbs were tiny, almost comically so, and its mouth, though lined with teeth, seemed to form a curious expression rather than a snarl. "It's a baby," Tommy realized aloud, a smile spreading across his face. The baby T-Rex took a small step closer, its claws sinking lightly into the dirt. Tommy froze, watching as its massive head inched toward him. The creature's nostrils flared again, sniffing at the air between them. Tommy's heart thudded loudly in his chest, but he didn't move. "Hi," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." Slowly, carefully, Tommy reached into his bag and pulled out a cracker. It was crumbled from being in his pocket, but it was all he had to offer. He held it out in his open palm, his small hand shaking slightly. "You hungry?" The baby dinosaur stared at the cracker for a long moment, its amber eyes flicking between Tommy and the snack. Then, slowly, it lowered its massive head until its snout was just a breath away from Tommy's hand. Its tongue flicked out, a quick, pink dart, and scooped up the cracker with surprising gentleness. Tommy giggled, his fear dissolving into awe. "You like that, huh?" The T-Rex crunched the cracker noisily, its mouth working awkwardly as crumbs spilled from its lips. It let out a soft sound, a mix between a purr and a grunt, that made Tommy laugh again. "You're not scary at all," Tommy said, grinning. "You're just hungry." The baby T-Rex tilted its head again, as though considering Tommy's words. Then, without warning, it took a step closer, so close now that Tommy could feel the warmth of its breath against his face. The dinosaur sniffed at him again, its amber eyes watching him with surprising intelligence. Tommy reached out slowly, his hand hovering in the air before coming to rest on the creature's snout. Its skin was warm and smooth, like leather left out in the sun. The baby T-Rex didn't flinch or pull away. It simply stood there, watching him with a gaze that felt far older than it should have. For a long moment, they stayed like that, boy and dinosaur, two creatures from different worlds sharing a single, impossible moment of trust. Tommy smiled, his fingers brushing gently against the dinosaur's snout. "I'm gonna call you Rex," he whispered. "Is that okay?" The dinosaur let out another soft grunt, and Tommy laughed, deciding to take that as a yes. "Tommy!" The sound of his name cut through the air like a blade, sharp and urgent. Tommy's head snapped up, his heart racing. It was his mother's voice, calling for him from somewhere beyond the trees. "Tommy, where are you?" Panic flared in his chest. "Oh no," he muttered. He looked back at the baby T-Rex, who had stepped back slightly at the sound. Its head was lifted now, its amber eyes darting toward the direction of the voice. Tommy crouched down, his hands resting on his knees as he looked at the dinosaur. "I have to go," he said softly. "That's my mom. But I'll come back. Okay? Promise?" The baby T-Rex stared at him for a moment, its expression unreadable. Then it let out a soft, mournful sound, a low rumble that seemed to echo in Tommy's chest. "I'll come back," Tommy repeated, his voice firm. He stood, brushing dirt off his shorts before looking back one last time. "Stay here, okay? Don't let anyone see you." With that, Tommy turned and ran. His small legs carried him quickly through the woods, his breath coming in short bursts as he ducked under branches and leapt over roots. His mother's voice grew louder as he ran, until finally, he burst out of the trees into the open clearing where their campsite sat. "Tommy!" His mother was standing near the tent, her face a mix of anger and relief as she ran toward him. She scooped him up in her arms, holding him tightly as she muttered, "Where were you? You scared me half to death." Tommy buried his face in her shoulder, his mind still spinning from what had just happened. He wanted to tell her, wanted to shout about the baby dinosaur he'd found, about how he'd touched its snout and fed it crackers, but something stopped him. "Sorry, Mom," he said quietly. His mother set him down, brushing a stray leaf from his hair as she sighed. "You can't just wander off like that, Tommy. It's dangerous out there." "I know," Tommy mumbled. His mother gave him a stern look before ruffling his hair. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As Tommy followed her back to the campsite, he glanced over his shoulder at the woods. The trees stood still and silent, but he knew the truth. Somewhere in the forest, Rex was waiting for him. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin walls of the tent, waking Tommy before anyone else. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as his thoughts came rushing back to him. Rex, the baby dinosaur, hadn't been a dream. Tommy could still feel the warmth of its smooth skin against his hand, the way it had sniffed at him with curiosity instead of fear. A grin spread across his face as he jumped out of his sleeping bag, his little heart thumping with excitement. Tommy crept quietly out of the tent, careful not to wake his parents. The campground was still half asleep, the air cool and crisp in the early morning light. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant sound of a stream trickled through the trees. He had to see Rex again. Tommy grabbed a banana from the picnic table, slipping it into the pocket of his shorts before dashing toward the treeline. The woods felt different in the early hours, quieter, calmer, like the forest was still waking up. The ground was damp with dew, Tommy's sneakers leaving faint prints in the soft earth as he hurried down the familiar deer trail. The clearing wasn't far. He could feel it, like it was calling him back. As Tommy stepped into the open space, his eyes darted immediately to where he'd seen Rex the day before. At first, the clearing looked empty, and his heart sank. Maybe he left, but then there was movement. A rustle of leaves near the far edge of the trees, and Tommy froze. Slowly, the baby T-Rex stepped into the clearing, its massive head tilting slightly as its amber eyes landed on Tommy. Tommy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rex, the baby dinosaur, blinked slowly, sniffing the air before taking a cautious step forward. Its footsteps were soft, almost comically delicate for something with such sharp claws. Tommy grinned, pulling the banana from his pocket and holding it up. "Look what I brought you." Rex's head lifted slightly, its nostrils twitching as it caught the scent of the fruit. The dinosaur inched closer, its movements still hesitant but curious, until it was standing just a few feet away. Tommy peeled the banana and held it out, his small hand steady despite the excitement bubbling in his chest. "Go on," he whispered. "It's good, I promise." Rex sniffed the banana once, then licked it with a quick flick of its pink tongue. Tommy giggled as the dinosaur's mouth opened, its teeth crunching the soft fruit in one quick bite. Juice dribbled onto the ground as Rex chewed awkwardly, its wide eyes blinking in what Tommy swore was satisfaction. "You like bananas, huh?" Tommy laughed, stepping a little closer. He could see more details now. Tiny scales along Rex's snout, the way its nostrils flared softly when it breathed. Its amber eyes were bright and alert, filled with a surprising intelligence. Rex let out a soft sound, somewhere between a purr and a chirp, that made Tommy's grin widen. "You're not scary at all," he said again, crouching down to get a better look. "You're just a big baby, aren't you?" The baby dinosaur tilted its head, almost as though it understood Tommy's words. It let out another sound, this one lower and more drawn out. Tommy reached out carefully, placing his hand on Rex's snout once again. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm your friend." Rex blinked slowly, leaning into Tommy's touch. For a long moment, the two of them just stayed like that, boy and dinosaur, connected in a way that defied explanation. Tommy's heart swelled with joy, the kind only a child could feel when encountering something so magical and unexpected. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a loud snap echoed through the trees. Rex's head shot up, its entire body going tense. Tommy froze, his hands still on the dinosaur's snout as his eyes darted toward the edge of the clearing. "Rex," Tommy whispered, his voice tight. The baby dinosaur sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and let out a low, rumbling growl that made the hairs on the back of Tommy's neck stand up. For the first time, he saw something that looked like fear in Rex's amber eyes. Tommy turned slowly, his own breath caught in his throat. A shadow shifted at the far end of the clearing, just beyond the trees. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a wide-brimmed hat and binoculars slung around his neck. He was holding something in his hands, though from this distance, Tommy couldn't tell what it was. The man froze as he spotted Tommy and Rex. His eyes widened, his mouth falling open slightly as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tommy's heart started to pound. "Rex, we have to go." The baby T-Rex let out a soft whine, its eyes flicking between Tommy and the man. It didn't want to leave, but it could sense the tension in the air, the sharp edge of danger that now surrounded them. The man took a slow step forward, his voice low and urgent. "Kid, get away from that thing." Tommy shook his head, his fingers curling gently into Rex's scaly skin. "No," he said firmly. "He's my friend." "Friend?" The man stared at him like he'd gone mad. "That's a dinosaur, kid. You can't be here." Tommy's grip on Rex tightened. "He's not hurting anyone." The man didn't listen. He raised something to his mouth, a radio, and began speaking quickly into it. Tommy couldn't hear everything he said, but he caught the words, confirmed sighting, and send backup. His stomach dropped. Rex, we need to go now. The baby dinosaur let out a distressed chirp, clearly frightened by the man's raised voice and sudden movements. Tommy grabbed its snout gently, forcing its amber eyes to meet his. Come on. I know a place where you'll be safe. Rex hesitated for only a moment longer before stepping back, turning toward the trees at the far end of the clearing. Tommy grabbed its small, clawed arm and began leading it away, his little legs moving as fast as they could. Hey, stop, the man shouted behind them, but Tommy didn't look back. He and Rex pushed through the underbrush, branches whipping at Tommy's face and arms as they ran. The baby T-Rex stumbled slightly over a fallen log, but Tommy pulled it forward, his small body moving with the kind of determination only a child could muster. Just a little farther, Tommy panted, his voice shaking. The forest felt different now. Darker, the shadows more pronounced as they ran deeper into the trees. The sounds of the man shouting grew fainter behind them, but Tommy didn't stop. He knew they couldn't. Finally, after what felt like forever, they broke through the trees into a small, hidden ravine. The walls of the valley rose steeply on either side, and a small stream ran through the middle, its water clear and cold. The sunlight filtered down in golden streaks, turning the space into something that looked almost magical. Tommy stumbled to a stop, breathing hard as he turned to look at Rex. We're safe here, he whispered. No one will find you. The baby dinosaur let out a low rumble, its body relaxing slightly as it sniffed the air. It seemed to sense that this place was different. Calmer, quieter, untouched. Tommy dropped to the ground, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He watched as Rex explored the ravine, sniffing at the water before taking a cautious sip. A small laugh bubbled out of Tommy's throat, relief washing over him. I told you I'd keep you safe, he said softly. Rex turned back toward him, its amber eyes bright as it let out a soft chirp, almost like a thank you. Tommy grinned, his fingers brushing through the grass as he leaned back against a rock. This can be your new home, he whispered. No one will bother you here. For a long time, they stayed like that. Tommy sitting quietly, Rex moving carefully through the ravine as though discovering the world for the first time. The boy felt calm here, safe in a way he couldn't explain. But deep down, Tommy knew this wasn't over. The man with the radio had seen Rex. People would come looking for him and they wouldn't understand. Tommy glanced at Rex, who was now chasing a butterfly with surprising gentleness. I'll keep you safe, Tommy promised softly. No matter what happens. Tommy sat against the cool rock, his legs stretched out as he watched Rex explore the ravine. The baby T-Rex moved with an awkward sort of grace, its large head bobbing as it sniffed at flowers and flicked its tail through the shallow water. For all its strength and claws, Rex was still just a baby, curious, clumsy, and full of wonder. Tommy smiled faintly, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. This hidden place felt safe. The trees on either side of the ravine formed a natural wall, their branches twisting overhead like a canopy that shielded them from the outside world. Sunlight dappled the grass and rocks, turning the small stream into a ribbon of gold that trickled softly through the valley. For a while, Tommy forgot the danger, forgot the man with the radio and the panic that had gripped him in the clearing. All he could see was Rex, chasing after a butterfly, his stubby little arms flapping in a way that made Tommy laugh. You're terrible at that, Tommy said with a grin. Rex stopped suddenly, his head snapping up as though he'd heard something. Tommy's laughter died in his throat, and he sat up straighter. Rex, the dinosaur's amber eyes scanned the ravine, his body going tense as his nostrils flared. Tommy held his breath, his heart pounding as he looked around. The forest beyond the ravine was still, eerily still, but something wasn't right. A faint sound reached Tommy's ears, the distant crackle of a radio, followed by muffled voices. His stomach dropped. They're coming, he whispered. Rex let out a low rumble, a sound Tommy recognized as fear. The dinosaur took a cautious step closer to Tommy, its body shifting protectively as though it could sense the same threat. Tommy scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. "We have to hide," he said, his voice shaking. He grabbed Rex's snout gently, forcing the dinosaur's wide eyes to meet his own. "Come on, this way." The ravine wasn't large, but Tommy remembered seeing an outcrop of rocks farther down, tucked into the steep wall like a shallow cave. He grabbed Rex's clawed hand, small compared to its body, and led the dinosaur quickly toward it, his legs pumping as fast as they could. The voices grew louder now, echoing faintly through the trees. "Spread out. Check the stream." Tommy's chest tightened. "They're close." Rex followed him, stumbling slightly over the uneven ground as his tail swayed for balance. When they reached the rocky outcrop, Tommy ducked low, pulling Rex in behind him. The cave was shallow, but it was just deep enough to hide them from sight. Tommy pressed himself against the cool stone wall, his arm curled protectively around Rex's neck as the dinosaur crouched beside him. "Shoo," Tommy whispered, his lips close to Rex's ear. "We have to stay quiet, okay?" Rex let out a soft, anxious sound that rumbled through his chest, but he didn't move. His amber eyes stayed locked on the cave's entrance, his nostrils flaring faintly with each breath. Tommy held his own breath as the voices came closer. Footsteps crunched on the gravel near the stream, slow and deliberate, like someone was searching carefully. "Anything over there?" one voice called out. "Nothing yet," another replied, closer this time. It couldn't have gone far. Tommy's heart pounded so loudly he was sure they would hear it. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing himself closer to Rex as he tried to stay as still as possible. The baby dinosaur didn't move, though Tommy could feel its muscles trembling slightly beneath his arm. Minutes passed. The footsteps grew fainter, the voices more distant. Finally, the forest fell silent again, save for the faint trickle of the stream. Tommy let out a shaky breath, his body sagging against the rock. "They're gone," he whispered. Rex turned his head slightly, letting out a soft chirp that sounded almost like a question. Tommy smiled faintly, brushing his hand along the dinosaur's snout. "You did good, Rex. Real good." The baby T-Rex chirped again, this time more playfully, and Tommy couldn't help but laugh softly. "You're not scared, are you? You're braver than I am." Rex tilted his head, blinking slowly before nuzzling Tommy's shoulder with his snout. It was a simple gesture, but it made Tommy's chest swell with warmth. For a moment, he forgot about the voices, the men with radios, and the danger that loomed just beyond the trees. It was just him and Rex, two unlikely friends sharing a secret the world wouldn't understand. The afternoon stretched on as Tommy and Rex stayed hidden in the ravine. Tommy knew they couldn't stay there forever, but he didn't know what else to do. If those men found Rex, they'd take him away. Tommy wasn't sure where, but he knew it wouldn't be good. They'd lock Rex in a cage, or worse, they'd hurt him. Tommy wouldn't let that happen. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the forest in streaks of gold and orange, Tommy stood and stretched his legs. "We need a plan," he said, glancing at Rex, who was curled up beside the rock wall like a giant, scaly puppy. "You can't stay here forever." Rex lifted his head, letting out a soft chirp. Tommy looked around the ravine, his mind spinning. He remembered reading about hidden valleys and lost worlds in his dinosaur books. Places where creatures like Rex could live safely, away from people. Maybe there's a place like that out here, Tommy thought. Somewhere deep in the forest where no one would find him. Tommy knelt down beside Rex, his small hand brushing against the dinosaur's side. "We're gonna find you a safe place," he whispered. "Somewhere you don't have to hide anymore." Rex blinked slowly, his amber eyes filled with something Tommy could only describe as trust. A rustle in the trees made Tommy's head snap up, his heart leaping into his throat. He grabbed Rex's clawed hand, his voice low but urgent. "Come on, we need to move." Rex scrambled to his feet, his tail swishing awkwardly as he followed Tommy toward the far end of the ravine. They moved quickly, ducking beneath branches and stepping carefully over rocks to avoid making noise. The forest seemed quieter now, as though it too were holding its breath. Tommy led Rex deeper into the woods, his small body weaving easily through the underbrush. Rex followed close behind, his heavy footsteps muffled by the damp earth. After what felt like hours, Tommy spotted something through the trees. A rocky hill that rose sharply from the ground, its base hidden beneath layers of ivy and moss. He hurried toward it, pulling Rex along with him. As they got closer, Tommy realized there was an opening in the rocks. An old cave, its entrance half hidden by vines. "This is perfect," Tommy breathed, his voice filled with hope. He turned to Rex, who was sniffing cautiously at the cave's entrance. "It's hidden. You'll be safe here." Rex let out a soft, questioning rumble, his eyes flicking between Tommy and the cave. Tommy smiled, patting the dinosaur's snout gently. "It's okay. I'll come visit you, I promise." Rex hesitated for only a moment longer before stepping inside. The cave was shallow at first, but as Tommy followed him, he realized it opened up into a larger chamber, its ceiling high enough for Rex to stand comfortably. Light filtered in through small gaps in the rocks, casting soft beams across the floor. Tommy grinned, his voice echoing softly off the stone walls. "This is perfect, Rex. It's like your own secret hideout." Rex chirped happily, his tail swishing as he explored the space. Tommy watched him for a moment, his chest filling with relief. This place felt safe, hidden. The men with the radios wouldn't find Rex here, not if Tommy could help it. Tommy sat down against the cave wall, pulling his knees to his chest as he watched Rex settle down on the far side of the chamber. The baby dinosaur curled up like a cat, his large head resting on his claws as his amber eyes blinked slowly. "You'll be okay now," Tommy whispered, his voice soft. "No one can hurt you here." Rex let out a contented sigh, his breathing slowing as he began to drift off. Tommy smiled faintly, his own eyes growing heavy as the stress of the day began to catch up with him. For the first time since he'd found Rex, Tommy felt calm. The cave was quiet, the air cool and still. Rex was safe. That was all that mattered. As Tommy leaned his head back against the stone, his thoughts began to drift. He knew this wasn't over, that the men would keep searching, that they'd never stop looking for Rex. But for now, they were hidden. For now, they were safe. And no matter what happened, Tommy knew one thing for sure. He would protect Rex. The cave stayed quiet as night fell. Outside, the forest hummed with sounds Tommy could barely hear from their hiding place. Crickets chirping, owls hooting softly in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves as something unseen moved through the underbrush. But inside the cave, all was still. Tommy woke with a start. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The walls of the cave loomed around him, shadows pooling in its corners, and the cool stone floor pressed against his legs. Then he saw Rex, still curled up in the far corner, his massive head resting on his claws as he snored softly. Tommy let out a shaky breath, his heart settling. "It's okay," he whispered to himself. "We're still here." He sat up, rubbing his eyes as he glanced toward the cave entrance. A faint silver light filtered in through the gaps in the vines, casting long streaks across the rocky floor. The moon was out, high and bright. Tommy frowned as he glanced outside, the silence tugging at something deep in his chest. His parents. They must have been looking for him by now. His mom would be worried sick, and his dad would be out with a flashlight calling his name over and over. Guilt tugged at Tommy's heart, but when he glanced back at Rex, who was still fast asleep, the feeling wavered. Rex needed him. If he left now, those men would find Rex before morning. Tommy had no doubt about that. They had radios and flashlights and big boots that trampled through the underbrush without a care for what got in their way. Rex wouldn't stand a chance, not alone. Tommy crawled closer to Rex, his fingers brushing gently over the dinosaur's scales. "I'll figure it out," he whispered softly, as though he might wake the baby T-Rex with his words. "I'll come back for you. Promise." Rex let out a soft, sleepy chirp but didn't open his eyes. Tommy smiled faintly before standing up, brushing dirt from his jeans. He crept toward the cave entrance, stepping carefully so his footsteps wouldn't echo. He'd go back to the campground, find his parents, and get them to leave as quickly as possible. If he was lucky, the men searching for Rex wouldn't figure out where the dinosaur had gone. The forest was colder now, the night air sharp as Tommy ducked through the vines and stepped outside. The moon bathed the forest in silvery light, turning the trees into dark, looming figures that swayed faintly in the breeze. Tommy shivered, wrapping his arms around himself as he followed the path back through the ravine. "It's not far," he told himself. "I just have to get back to camp. Then I'll come back for Rex in the morning." He moved quickly, his small feet making soft sounds on the forest floor. The woods were darker than they had been during the day, the shadows deeper and harder to ignore. Every rustle of leaves made him jump, every creak of a branch sounding like footsteps just behind him. "It's just the forest," Tommy reminded himself, his voice shaking slightly. "Just the trees and the wind." But then he heard it. Voices. Tommy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. Men talking somewhere nearby. Their voices carried on the wind, words jumbled but sharp, like they were arguing. "Must have gone this way. Can't lose it now." The footprint trail. Tommy's heart raced, panic flooding his chest. "They're close." He crouched low, pressing himself against the trunk of a nearby tree as he tried to steady his breathing. The men were farther down the path, but they were moving in the same direction he was, toward the ravine. If they followed his trail, they'd find the cave. They'd find Rex. Tommy's eyes darted around the forest, searching for another way out. He couldn't let the men see him, not now. Rex was counting on him. There was no clear path, no deer trail to follow. Just dense underbrush and trees stretching endlessly into the dark. Tommy swallowed hard, glancing back toward the voices before making a decision. He turned sharply, ducking into the thickest part of the forest he could find. Branches whipped at his face as he pushed through the brush, his small body slipping between the trees more easily than any adult could. Thorns tugged at his shirt, leaves crunched softly beneath his sneakers, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The voices faded slowly behind him, growing quieter until they were little more than faint murmurs. Tommy finally stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he braced himself against a tree. His palms were scraped, and his legs ached, but he didn't care. "They didn't see me," he whispered, relief washing over him like a wave. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. The forest all looked the same in the dark. Tree after tree, shadow after shadow. He wasn't sure how far he'd come, but at least the men weren't following him. For now. Tommy straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. He needed to get back to the campsite, find his parents, and make sure they left the area as soon as possible. Then he could figure out what to do about Rex. He turned, searching for the faint silver glow of the moon through the branches. But as he took a step forward, a noise stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't a voice. It was a growl, a low, rumbling sound that made the hair on the back of Tommy's neck stand up straight. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest as he slowly turned toward the sound. Something moved in the shadows. Tommy squinted, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. At first, he couldn't make anything out, just the faint outline of trees and leaves swaying in the breeze. But then he saw it. A shape, much larger than Rex, stepped into the faint glow of moonlight. Tommy's breath caught in his throat as he stared up at the creature. Its body was massive, far taller than any tree in the ravine. Its skin was darker than Rex's, mottled with stripes of black and gray that blended perfectly with the shadows. Its head was huge, its jaws lined with teeth as long as Tommy's arm. It was another dinosaur. Tommy's legs trembled as he stepped back, his mind racing. It's not Rex. It's something else. He knew what it was. He'd seen pictures in his books, read the names over and over until they were burned into his memory. An adult Tyrannosaurus Rex. The massive creature tilted its head, its amber eyes locking onto Tommy as it sniffed the air. The growl rumbled deep in its chest, vibrating through the ground like the distant roll of thunder. Tommy couldn't move. He was frozen, his body paralyzed as the enormous dinosaur took a slow step forward, its claws sinking deep into the earth. Its breath came out in heavy bursts, misting faintly in the cold night air. "Please," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. The T-Rex tilted its head again, watching him carefully. For a moment, Tommy thought it might lunge at him, its teeth snapping and its roar shaking the trees. But then something changed. The dinosaur's nostrils flared again, and its head lifted slightly, as though it had caught a new scent. Rex, the adult T-Rex, turned sharply, its massive tail swiping through the underbrush as it stomped back into the forest. Its footsteps were heavy, shaking the ground with each step, but it moved with surprising speed. Within moments, it had vanished into the shadows, leaving Tommy standing alone in the dark. He let out a shaky breath, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. "It's looking for Rex," he whispered, his voice trembling. Tommy's mind raced. The adult T-Rex wasn't just some random dinosaur. It was Rex's parent. It must have been searching for him, following the trail Tommy had made through the forest. And now it was heading toward the ravine, toward the cave where Rex was hiding. Tommy's chest tightened with fear. If the men found the adult dinosaur, if they found Rex, "I have to stop them," Tommy said aloud, his voice steady despite the panic rising inside him. "I have to get back to Rex before they do." With that, Tommy turned and ran. Tommy sprinted through the darkened forest, his small feet pounding against the earth as he pushed himself to move faster. Branches whipped at his face, leaves crunched beneath his sneakers, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The image of the massive adult T-Rex stalking toward the ravine burned in his mind like a warning. "It's looking for Rex," Tommy thought, panic tightening in his chest. "And those men are close too. If they find him," the thought made his heart ache. Rex didn't deserve this. He was just a baby, curious and playful and trusting. He didn't know that the people searching for him meant danger. Tommy had to get back to the cave first, had to warn Rex and help him escape. The moonlight filtered faintly through the trees, giving Tommy just enough light to see where he was going. He didn't dare look back. Every crack of a branch or distant shout made him flinch, but he kept running, ducking under low-hanging limbs and leaping over roots that jutted up like hands trying to grab his ankles. Finally, Tommy broke through the trees and stumbled into the ravine. He paused for a second, bent over with his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. The hidden valley was just as he'd left it, quiet, still, and bathed in faint silver light. "Rex," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling as he straightened up. "Rex, where are you?" The baby T-Rex emerged cautiously from the cave, its massive head poking out into the moonlight. Its amber eyes locked onto Tommy, and it let out a soft, questioning chirp. Tommy's heart leapt with relief. "Rex." He ran toward the cave, reaching out to grab the dinosaur's snout in his small hands. "You have to come with me. We have to go. Now." Rex blinked slowly, tilting his head as though trying to understand Tommy's urgency. He let out a low rumble, his body shifting awkwardly as he stepped fully out of the cave. Tommy tugged gently at his clawed arm, his voice pleading. "Please, Rex. We don't have time. There's another dinosaur, your parent, I think, and those men are coming. We can't let them find you." Rex let out a chirp, his amber eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. For a long moment, he didn't move, as though he was frozen by Tommy's words. Then, as if understanding the danger, the baby T-Rex finally stepped forward. "Good boy," Tommy whispered, his heart pounding. "We're gonna get out of here. Promise." Tommy led Rex back toward the far edge of the ravine, moving quickly but carefully as the dinosaur stumbled after him. Rex wasn't built for speed. Not yet. But he followed Tommy's lead, his small claws digging into the soft dirt with each step. The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless. Tommy glanced nervously at the trees, his ears straining for any sound of the men or the adult T-Rex that might be nearby. "Please don't find us," he thought desperately. The sound of snapping branches made Tommy freeze. Rex stopped too, his head lifting sharply as his nostrils flared. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the sound vibrating through the air like a warning. Tommy turned slowly, his breath catching as he spotted movement at the far end of the ravine. At first, it was just a shadow, large and shifting in the darkness. But then the moonlight caught it, and Tommy's chest tightened. The adult T-Rex. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive head swaying back and forth as it sniffed the air. Its amber eyes glowed faintly in the dark, locked onto Rex with an intensity that sent a shiver down Tommy's spine. "It's your parent," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up at Rex. "It's here for you." Rex let out a soft chirp, his body tense as he stared at the larger dinosaur. The adult T-Rex let out a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the ravine like distant thunder. It wasn't an angry roar. It was something else. A call. Tommy's chest tightened. He could feel Rex's hesitation, the pull of something deeper and instinctual. The baby dinosaur shifted on its feet, letting out a low, uncertain sound as it took a small step toward the adult. "Wait, Rex," Tommy whispered, his voice breaking. "They're still out there. Those men, they're coming." "It's not safe." Rex froze, his amber eyes flicking back toward Tommy. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, boy and dinosaur, connected by something neither of them fully understood. Then the adult T-Rex roared. The sound was deafening, a deep, guttural bellow that shook the ground and sent birds scattering from the trees. Tommy flinched, his hands clamping over his ears as he stumbled back. Rex let out a frightened chirp, pressing closer to Tommy as though seeking comfort. The adult T-Rex roared again, its massive claws digging into the earth as it took a step forward. It wasn't angry, it was searching, calling. And then, from somewhere nearby, Tommy heard shouting. "Over here! They're in the ravine!" Tommy's blood ran cold. The men were close, too close. Their voices echoed through the trees, accompanied by the faint crackle of radios and the heavy thud of boots. Rex let out a distressed sound, his small body trembling as he turned to look at Tommy. "I won't let them hurt you," Tommy whispered fiercely, grabbing Rex's snout in his small hands. "But we have to go. Now!" The adult T-Rex let out another deep call, its amber eyes narrowing as it spotted the men approaching from the far edge of the ravine. Tommy could hear them now. Sharp, panicked voices that shouted things like, "It's real," and "Get the tranquilizers." Rex whined softly, his body torn between Tommy and the massive creature that stood at the edge of the clearing. The adult T-Rex lowered its head, sniffing the air again as its growl deepened. "It's protecting Rex," Tommy realized suddenly. "It's looking for him, but it doesn't know what's happening." The men burst through the tree line, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The beams of light landed on the adult T-Rex first, and the reaction was immediate. "Holy! Get back! Fall back!" The adult T-Rex let out a roar that shook the ground, its massive tail swiping through the air as it turned sharply toward the men. One of them shouted something into a radio, but Tommy couldn't hear the words. All he could see was the chaos, the flashlights swinging wildly, the adult dinosaur's massive form looming over the men like a shadow. Tommy grabbed Rex's arm, pulling him sharply toward the trees. "Come on!" Rex stumbled after him, his claws skittering over the rocky ground as they ran. The baby dinosaur let out a distressed cry, his head swiveling back toward the adult T-Rex, but Tommy didn't stop. "They're going to hurt us!" "Rex!" Tommy shouted, his voice breaking. "We have to go!" The forest loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming. But Tommy pushed forward, weaving through the trees as quickly as his legs could carry him. Rex followed close behind, his heavy breaths filling the air as branches snapped beneath his weight. Behind them, the adult T-Rex roared again, a sound so loud it shook Tommy to his core. The men were shouting now, some of them yelling for backup, others screaming in fear as they scattered like insects beneath the dinosaur's fury. Tommy didn't look back. He led Rex deeper into the forest, his heart pounding as he searched for any place, anywhere, they could hide. The baby dinosaur struggled to keep up, stumbling over roots and slipping on the damp leaves. But Tommy didn't stop. Finally, he spotted something up ahead, a thick cluster of trees, their trunks twisted together like a wall. Tommy ran toward it, ducking through a narrow gap between the branches. "Come on, Rex!" The baby T-Rex squeezed through after him, his large head barely clearing the narrow space. They emerged into a small hollow, hidden beneath the canopy of trees. The ground was soft with moss, the air thick and still. Tommy dropped to his knees, gasping for breath as he turned to look at Rex. The dinosaur flopped down beside him, his chest rising and falling heavily as he let out a soft, tired chirp. "We made it," Tommy whispered, his voice shaky. "We're safe here. At least for now." Rex blinked slowly, his amber eyes flicking toward Tommy as he let out a soft rumble that sounded almost like a question. Tommy reached out, placing his hand gently on Rex's snout. "I won't let them find you," he promised softly. No matter what, the sounds of the forest were faint now. Distant shouts, the occasional crash of branches as the men moved through the woods. But they were far away. For the moment, the two of them were hidden, tucked away in the hollow where no one could find them. Tommy leaned back against the tree trunk, his hands still resting on Rex's snout as he closed his eyes. The night stretched on around them, heavy and quiet, but Tommy didn't feel afraid anymore. As long as Rex was with him, he knew he wasn't alone. The forest was still and silent, the faint shouts of the men fading further into the distance as Tommy leaned against the tree trunk, his heart still racing. Rex lay beside him, his massive head resting on Tommy's lap as he let out a low, tired rumble. For the first time in what felt like hours, they could breathe. Tommy ran his small hand gently over Rex's snout, feeling the rise and fall of his breaths beneath his fingertips. "We'll be okay," he whispered softly, more to himself than to Rex. "They won't find us here." But even as he said it, doubt clawed at the back of his mind. The men were searching the forest. They had radios and flashlights, and they weren't going to give up. Rex was too big, too loud, and too incredible to stay hidden for long. Tommy's small chest tightened as he glanced toward the dense wall of trees, his mind racing with worry. Rex shifted slightly, his amber eyes blinking open as he looked up at Tommy. He let out a soft chirp, tilting his head as though sensing Tommy's unease. Tommy smiled faintly, brushing his hand along the dinosaur's smooth scales. "It's okay, Rex. I'm just thinking." Rex let out another quiet sound, almost like a sigh, before closing his eyes again. The baby dinosaur was exhausted, Tommy realized. They'd been running for hours, hiding from men with flashlights and roaring adult dinosaurs. Rex's small body, big to Tommy but small for a T-Rex, trembled faintly as he lay there, his breath slow and uneven. Tommy frowned, his fingers brushing against Rex's side. "You're tired, huh?" he whispered. "It's okay. You can rest now." But as Tommy sat there, the cold seeping through his shirt and into his skin, his thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. He had no idea what to do next. He couldn't take Rex home. His parents would never understand, and the men would find them before morning. He couldn't leave Rex here alone either. It wasn't safe. The forest was crawling with people who wouldn't stop until they found the dinosaur. Tommy's gaze drifted toward the sky, where thin streaks of moonlight pierced the canopy of leaves. He thought back to all the books he'd read about dinosaurs, about hidden valleys and lost worlds where creatures like Rex could live in peace. What if there's a place like that out here? Tommy whispered to himself. Somewhere no one else can go. Somewhere safe. Rex's tail twitched slightly, as though responding to Tommy's voice, but he didn't open his eyes. Tommy looked down at him, determination hardening in his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he had to try. If there was even the smallest chance he could keep Rex safe, he wasn't going to give up. "We're going to find it," Tommy said softly, stroking Rex's snout. "I don't know where yet, but I'll get you there. Promise." The first streaks of dawn were beginning to break through the trees when Tommy heard it. A faint sound, a soft rustle of leaves, followed by the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping beneath someone's boot. Tommy's eyes shot open, his entire body going rigid as his ears strained to listen. "They're here." Rex lifted his head, his amber eyes wide as he sniffed the air. He let out a low, uneasy growl that rumbled deep in his chest. Tommy placed a hand on Rex's snout, trying to steady him. "Shoo," he whispered. "We can't let them hear us." But the sound grew louder. Voices carried faintly on the wind, mixed with the crackle of radios and the distant hum of engines. "They're close," Tommy muttered, his heart pounding. He stood quickly, pulling Rex's arm to get him up. "Come on, Rex. We have to move." Rex let out a soft, frightened sound but scrambled to his feet, his tail swishing clumsily as he followed Tommy out of the hollow. The forest ahead was thick, the trees packed tightly together, but Tommy didn't care. They had to keep moving. Tommy led Rex deeper into the woods, ducking beneath branches and pushing through the underbrush. The voices grew louder behind them, the men closing in with each passing second. Tommy's chest ached as he ran, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "Over here!" a voice shouted suddenly, so close it made Tommy flinch. Rex let out a terrified chirp, his amber eyes wide with panic as he stumbled over a root. Tommy grabbed his clawed hand, pulling him forward with all the strength he could muster. "Come on, Rex!" They burst into a small clearing, the trees giving way to an open patch of grass bathed in the faint light of early morning. Tommy froze, his eyes darting around desperately. There was nowhere to hide. "Tommy!" The shout came from behind him, sharp and familiar. Tommy turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat as he spotted a figure running toward him. It wasn't one of the men with radios. It was his dad. Tommy's father looked frantic, his face pale and lined with worry as he stumbled into the clearing. He froze when he saw the baby dinosaur standing beside Tommy, his eyes going wide with disbelief. "What in the—" Tommy stepped in front of Rex, his small arms spreading out protectively. "Dad, don't," he shouted. "Don't hurt him." His father stared at him, his mouth opening and closing as though he couldn't find the words. "Tommy, what is that?" "It's Rex," Tommy said quickly, his voice trembling. "He's my friend. He's not dangerous. I promise." Rex let out a soft chirp, lowering his massive head behind Tommy as though trying to hide. Tommy's dad took a step closer, his eyes locked on the dinosaur with a mix of fear and awe. "Tommy, you need to come with me. There are men out here. Men looking for that thing. It's not safe. We can't let them find him." Tommy cried, tears pricking at his eyes. "They'll take him away, Dad. They'll hurt him." His father hesitated, his brow furrowing deeply as he looked at Tommy. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he let out a long breath and crouched down in front of his son. "Tommy," he said softly, his voice steady, "you need to listen to me. Whatever this is, it's not our choice. There are people out there who are going to find it no matter what we do." Tommy shook his head fiercely, his tears spilling over. "No, I promised Rex I'd protect him. I can't let them take him, Dad." His father looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening. He glanced up at Rex, who was watching them with wide, fearful eyes, his body trembling slightly. "Okay," his father said finally, his voice low. "Okay, Tommy, but we have to move fast. If we're gonna get him out of here, we can't stay in one place." Tommy blinked, his breath catching. You believe me?" His father smiled faintly, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I don't know what's happening here, but I know you, Tommy. If you say he's your friend, then I believe you." Tommy let out a shaky laugh, his tears still streaking down his cheeks as he turned to Rex. "Come on, Rex. We're gonna get you out of here." Rex chirped softly, stepping closer to Tommy as his tail swished behind him. Tommy's father stood, glancing nervously toward the trees. "There's an old service road not far from here," he said quickly. "If we can get to it before those men catch up, we might have a chance." Tommy nodded, grabbing Rex's clawed hand as his father turned and led them back into the forest. They moved quickly but carefully, weaving through the trees as the morning light began to brighten the sky. "Stay quiet," Tommy's father whispered, his voice low. "We don't want them to hear us." Tommy nodded, his grip on Rex's hand tightening. The baby dinosaur followed close behind, his massive feet making soft thuds against the earth as they moved. He let out the occasional low chirp, his amber eyes darting nervously around the forest, but Tommy squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's okay, Rex," Tommy whispered. "We're almost there." The forest began to thin as they neared the service road, the trees giving way to a narrow, overgrown path. Tommy's father led the way, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were still together. Almost there, he said quietly, his voice tense. But before they could take another step, a sharp sound cut through the air. A shout. "They're over here!" Tommy's blood ran cold. He turned quickly, his eyes widening as he spotted figures moving through the trees behind them. Flashlights swung wildly, and the crackle of radios filled the air as the men closed in. "Run!" Tommy's father shouted. Tommy grabbed Rex's hand tightly, his small legs pumping as they bolted toward the service road. The baby T-Rex stumbled after him, his breaths coming in loud, panicked bursts as the ground shook beneath his heavy steps. The men were close, too close. Tommy could hear them shouting, hear the snap of branches as they crashed through the underbrush. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Come on, Rex!" Tommy cried, his voice breaking. "We're almost there." The forest erupted into chaos. The men's shouts grew louder, closer, their flashlights cutting jagged beams of light through the trees. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, pulling Rex forward with every ounce of strength he had. "Faster, Rex!" Tommy cried, his voice cracking with desperation. Rex stumbled slightly, his claws skidding on the uneven ground as he tried to keep up. The baby dinosaur was panicked now. His breaths were loud and ragged, his tail swishing wildly as though trying to keep his balance. Tommy's father ran ahead of them, glancing back over his shoulder every few steps. "We're almost there," his dad shouted. "Come on!" Tommy could see it now, the faint outline of the service road just beyond the thinning trees. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was their only chance. If they could make it to the road, they might be able to follow it far enough to escape the men chasing them. "Tommy!" A shout from behind made Tommy whip his head around. Through the gaps in the trees, he spotted them. At least 5 men, their faces shadowed by the glow of their flashlights. One of them pointed in their direction, his voice sharp and frantic. "There it is! The dinosaur! Don't let it get away!" Tommy's chest tightened with fear. He turned back toward Rex, pulling hard on the baby dinosaur's arm. "Come on, Rex! You have to move faster." Rex let out a frightened chirp but obeyed, stumbling after Tommy as they pushed toward the road. Tommy's father was already there, his arms waving frantically as he called to them. "Hurry, Tommy! Hurry!" The service road was rough and uneven, cracked with weeds and strewn with fallen branches, but it stretched out into the forest like a forgotten path. Tommy burst onto the road, Rex stumbling after him as the baby dinosaur let out a distressed cry. "Where do we go?" Tommy shouted to his dad, his voice shaking. His father grabbed Tommy's shoulder, glancing quickly toward the treeline. "There's an old bridge not far from here. It leads to the other side of the river. If we can get there, they won't be able to follow us easily." Tommy nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Let's go." The 3 of them ran down the service road, Rex's heavy footsteps pounding like drumbeats behind them. The baby T-Rex was struggling to keep up, but he pushed forward, his amber eyes darting around in fear. The shouts of the men echoed behind them, growing fainter but still far too close. "We'll make it," Tommy whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "We have to make it." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they ran. Tommy's legs ached, his lungs burned, and sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't dare stop. His father led the way, his eyes scanning the road for the bridge he'd mentioned. Finally, Tommy spotted it, a faint outline in the distance. The bridge was old and weathered, its wooden planks creaking beneath the weight of the years. A shallow river ran beneath it, its water dark and rushing quietly through the forest. "There!" Tommy's dad shouted, pointing toward the bridge. "Come on!" Tommy turned back toward Rex, his heart twisting as he saw the baby dinosaur struggling. Rex's movements were slower now. His breathing labored as though the effort of running had taken everything out of him. Tommy ran to Rex's side, pressing a hand against the dinosaur's snout. "Come on, Rex," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic threatening to choke him. "We're almost there. You can do it." Rex let out a soft, tired chirp, his amber eyes meeting Tommy's as though trying to understand what was happening. The dinosaur was scared. Tommy could see it in the way his body trembled, his claws scraping weakly against the ground. Tommy grabbed Rex's arm, tugging gently. "You can do this," he said again, his voice firm. "I'm not leaving you." Rex blinked slowly, then let out a low rumble, a sound that seemed almost like agreement. With a shuddering breath, the baby dinosaur straightened and took another step forward. "Good boy," Tommy whispered, his heart swelling with pride. The bridge was just ahead now. Tommy's father had already crossed to the other side, turning back to wave them forward. "Hurry, Tommy, they're coming." Tommy glanced back toward the road, his stomach knotting with fear as he saw flashlights flickering through the trees. The men were close, too close. "Come on, Rex," Tommy shouted, pulling the dinosaur toward the bridge. Rex stumbled onto the wooden planks, his claws clattering loudly as the bridge swayed beneath his weight. Tommy ran beside him, his small hands gripping Rex's side to keep him steady. The baby T-Rex let out a frightened whine, his tail swishing wildly as the bridge creaked and groaned beneath them. "You're okay," Tommy said breathlessly. "You're okay. Just a little farther." The men burst out of the trees just as Tommy and Rex reached the middle of the bridge. "There they are," one of them shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. A flashlight beam caught Tommy and Rex, illuminating them like a spotlight. Rex let out a panicked roar, his massive body swaying as he tried to move faster across the creaking bridge. "Stop," one of the men yelled. "Get the tranquilizers." Tommy's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, his eyes wide with panic as he grabbed Rex's snout. "Don't stop, Rex. Keep going." Rex stumbled forward, his claws scraping against the wooden planks as he pushed toward the other side. Tommy ran beside him, his chest heaving as his father shouted from the far end of the bridge. "Almost there, Tommy." But then Tommy heard it, a sharp crack, followed by the groan of splintering wood. He turned just in time to see one of the bridge's planks snap beneath Rex's weight. The baby T-Rex let out a terrified roar as his legs slipped through the gap, his body lurching dangerously to one side. "Rex!" Tommy screamed, grabbing the dinosaur's snout as though he could pull him back onto the bridge. Rex's amber eyes were wide with panic, his body trembling as he struggled to free himself. The bridge creaked loudly beneath him, the wooden planks groaning under the strain. Tommy's father ran toward them, his face pale with fear. "Tommy, get back," his dad shouted. "The bridge is going to collapse." "No," Tommy cried, tears streaming down his face as he clung to Rex's head. "I'm not leaving him." Rex let out another panicked roar, his claws scraping frantically against the wooden planks as he tried to pull himself free. Tommy's father reached them, grabbing Tommy's arm and pulling him back sharply. "Dad, no!" Tommy screamed, fighting against his father's grip. "We have to save him." The bridge groaned louder now, the sound almost deafening as more planks began to splinter and crack. Rex let out a final, desperate cry, his amber eyes locking onto Tommy's as the wooden planks beneath him gave way. "Rex!" Tommy screamed, his voice breaking as the baby dinosaur fell through the gap. The world seemed to slow as Tommy watched Rex disappear, his massive body plunging into the dark water below. The sound of the splash echoed through the forest, followed by silence, horrible, suffocating silence. Tommy fell to his knees, sobbing as his father knelt beside him, his arms wrapping tightly around Tommy's trembling body. "He's gone," Tommy whispered, his voice broken. "He's gone." The men reached the bridge moments later, their flashlights swinging wildly as they took in the scene. One of them stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Where's the dinosaur? What happened?" Tommy didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the dark water below, his chest aching with a grief he didn't understand. His father stood slowly, his expression hard as he looked at the men. "You scared it," he said flatly. "It fell." The men murmured amongst themselves, their flashlights sweeping across the broken bridge and the river below. Tommy didn't hear them. He didn't care. All he could think about was Rex, his friend, disappearing into the water. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice quiet. "Come on, Tommy. Let's go." Tommy didn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the river, even as the tears continued to fall down his face. "I promised him," he whispered. "I promised I'd keep him safe." His father knelt beside him again, his arms wrapping around Tommy's small frame. "You did everything you could," he said softly. "You tried to save him." Tommy buried his face in his father's shoulder, his sobs muffled as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The men moved quietly around them, their voices fading into background noise as the sun rose higher, casting its light across the forest. The river below ran silently, its surface smooth and unbroken, as though it held the secrets of what had happened there. But Tommy knew the truth. Somewhere, beneath the water's surface, Rex was gone. The sun climbed higher as Tommy sat motionless on the edge of the broken bridge, his small body curled against his father's side. The river below was quiet, its surface shimmering faintly in the golden light. It was as though nothing had happened, as though Rex had never been there at all. But Tommy knew better. He could still feel Rex's warm scales beneath his fingers, still hear the soft chirps the baby dinosaur had made when they played together. It didn't matter that it made no sense. Rex had been real, was real, and now he was gone. Tommy's father gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tommy," he said softly, "we need to go." Tommy didn't respond. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the river. It wasn't fair. Rex had trusted him, had followed him without question, and Tommy had promised to keep him safe. But he'd failed. "I let him fall." The men were still there, talking amongst themselves at the other end of the bridge. Their voices were low, laced with frustration and disbelief. One of them kicked angrily at the ground, muttering something about a missed opportunity. Another spoke into a radio, his tone sharp as though demanding answers. Tommy's father stood slowly, his brow furrowed as he looked at the men. "Come on, Tommy," he said gently, crouching down to help his son to his feet. "Let's get out of here." Reluctantly, Tommy allowed his father to pull him up. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight as he stared down at the broken planks of the bridge. The water below was calm now, rippling softly as it flowed past. Tommy wiped at his face with the back of his hand, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think he's okay?" His father didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the water, his expression conflicted. "Dinosaurs are strong, Tommy," he said finally. "If he survived this long, maybe." He let the sentence trail off, as though he couldn't bring himself to say the rest. Tommy swallowed hard, his heart aching. He wanted to believe it, wanted to picture Rex swimming safely downriver, hiding somewhere deep in the forest where no one would find him. But doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if Rex was hurt? What if he couldn't climb out? As they turned to leave, Tommy cast one last look at the river. "Goodbye, Rex," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry." The ride home was quiet. Tommy sat in the back seat of his father's car, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. The forest stretched endlessly on either side of the road, its shadows hiding secrets Tommy couldn't begin to guess. Somewhere out there, Rex might still be alive, or he might not. Tommy pressed his forehead against the glass, his chest tightening. He thought about the day they'd met, the way Rex had sniffed at him curiously, his massive eyes wide and trusting. Tommy had never felt so much wonder in his life, never imagined he'd get to touch a dinosaur, let alone befriend one. But now it was over. His father glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his voice gentle. "You okay, buddy?" Tommy didn't answer. He couldn't. The lump in his throat was too big. His mother was waiting for them when they pulled into the driveway. She rushed toward the car, her face pale and anxious. "Tommy!" she cried, pulling him into a tight hug as soon as he climbed out of the back seat. "Oh my gosh! Where have you been? We were so worried." Tommy didn't hug her back. He just stood there, staring down at the ground as tears pricked at his eyes again. His mom pulled back, her hands resting on his shoulders as she scanned his face. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Are you okay?" Tommy's father stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. He's okay. He just had a rough night. His mom looked between them, confusion and concern flickering across her face. But what happened out there? Did you find something? Tommy's father hesitated, glancing at his son before shaking his head. It's hard to explain, he said simply. Let's just let him rest for now. Tommy slipped out of his mother's grasp, walking quietly into the house. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to explain. All he wanted to do was close his eyes and pretend none of it had happened. Days passed, but the ache in Tommy's chest didn't go away. He spent hours staring out his bedroom window, his thoughts drifting back to Rex. At night, he dreamed about the baby dinosaur, about the way Rex had chirped when he played, the way his scales had felt warm and smooth beneath Tommy's hand. In his dreams, Rex was safe. In his dreams, they were still in the forest, laughing and playing together as though nothing had changed. But every morning, Tommy woke up to an empty room and the heavy weight of reality. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Tommy sat alone in the backyard, his knees pulled to his chest as he stared at the tree line in the distance. The forest felt far away now, like a world he could never return to. His father stepped outside, sitting down beside him in the grass. Thinking about him? Tommy didn't look up. Yeah. His father let out a quiet sigh, staring toward the trees. I've been thinking too, he said softly, about what we saw out there. Tommy glanced at him, his brow furrowed. Do you think he's okay? His father didn't answer right away. I don't know, Tommy. I'd like to believe he is. Creatures like that, they've survived longer than we can imagine. Maybe he's out there, still looking for a place where he can be safe. Tommy blinked, his chest tightening. You think so? His dad smiled faintly, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. I do. Tommy looked back toward the forest, hope flickering faintly in his heart. He liked the thought of Rex out there, hidden somewhere deep in the woods, living a life no one else could touch. Maybe he'd find others like him. Maybe he'd grow big and strong, just like the dinosaurs in Tommy's books. The thought made him smile for the first time in days. I hope he's happy, Tommy whispered. His father squeezed his shoulder gently. Me too, buddy. Me too. Years later, when Tommy was older and the memories of that summer had begun to fade, he found himself walking through the same forest. The trees were taller now, their trunks thicker, but the forest still smelled the same, earthy and cool, like moss and rain. Tommy stopped at the edge of the ravine, his heart pounding as he looked around. The bridge was gone, its remains swallowed by the forest, but the river still flowed quietly beneath him. The sound of the water filled the air, soft and calming. He crouched down near the bank, brushing his fingers over the mossy stones. Rex, he whispered, the name tasting familiar on his lips after all these years. Are you still out there? The forest was quiet, but Tommy thought he heard something, just a faint sound carried on the breeze. It wasn't a roar or a chirp, but it was enough to make him smile. Somewhere deep in the forest, he liked to believe Rex was still there. Bigger now, stronger, but still the same curious creature he'd once called a friend. Tommy stood slowly, the sun warm on his back as he turned toward the trees. He knew he'd never see Rex again. Not in this life, but the memory of the baby dinosaur would always stay with him, as real and as wonderful as the day they'd met. And maybe that was enough.